Picture this someone you know who has always been kind, compassionate, and morally upright. A person who would never harm another soul, who stands for justice, who helps others without expecting anything in return. Now imagine that same person over time, becoming almost unrecognizable, cold, cruel, even capable of destruction. What drives this transformation? How does someone shift from being good to becoming something monstrous? Today we're going to uncover the psychological and philosophical forces that lie at the heart of human nature, the hidden mechanisms that slowly pull good people toward darkness. And stay with me, because the final revelation will be the most shocking of all, one that could forever change the way you see human nature. This is not just a theoretical discussion. Understanding this transformation is essential because it affects every one of us. You might believe you could never descend into cruelty, that you're immune to the forces that corrupt others. But history and science tell us otherwise. The terrifying truth is this: under the right conditions, anyone, no matter how kind, how just, how morally strong, can fall. Psychologist Philip Zimbardo, the man behind the infamous Stanford Prison Experiment, revealed how ordinary people, when placed in specific circumstances, could commit acts of cruelty they never imagined themselves capable of. His research, along with the obedience studies of Stanley Milgram, proves that our sense of morality is far more fragile than we'd like to believe. And here's the shocking part: most people don't even realize they're changing until it's already too late. So what are the forces that push this shift? What invisible influences slowly wear down a person's goodness, replacing it with something darker? That's exactly what we're going to uncover. From the slippery slope of moral compromise to the dangerous weight of authority, and finally to the subtle traps of self-justification, each factor plays a role in this descent. But before we go deeper, I want you to pause and ask yourself, could this process happen to you? The descent into darkness rarely begins with something dramatic. Instead, it often starts with the slow erosion of moral boundaries. This doesn't happen overnight. It begins with small compromises, tiny justifications, and subtle betrayals of one's own principles. Someone might tell themselves it's just a little thing, it doesn't really matter. But here's the danger: once the first line is crossed, the next becomes easier, and the one after that easier still. Psychologists call this the slippery slope effect. Imagine a well-intentioned person who bends the truth to protect someone they love, or bends the rules for what they believe is a good cause. At first, these actions feel harmless, even noble. But over time, each exception reshapes their identity. What was once unthinkable begins to feel reasonable, and soon the descent accelerates. But moral compromise isn't the only force at work. There's also the immense pressure of authority and obedience. One of the most chilling studies in psychology was conducted in the early 1960s by Stanley Milgram. Participants were instructed to administer what they believed were painful electric shocks to another person simply because an authority figure told them to. The results were shocking. The majority continued delivering shocks even when they thought they were causing serious harm. Why? Because they felt compelled to obey. This reveals a terrifying truth: under the right conditions, even good people can become tools of harm. Not because they are evil, but because they are following orders, conforming to duty, or fearing the consequences of disobedience. They tell themselves, I don't have a choice, I'm just doing what I'm told. And in that moment, morality is overwritten. But there's another factor, perhaps even more insidious: the power of group identity. When people tie their sense of self to a group, whether political, religious, social, or ideological, they begin to view outsiders as the other. And once that shift happens, a dangerous transformation begins. History is full of examples of ordinary people led to commit horrific acts, not because they woke up wanting to be monsters, but because they came to see their enemies as less than human. This process of dehumanization allows cruelty to be justified because the victim is no longer seen as deserving of empathy. The scariest part: none of this happens all at once. It's gradual, it's subtle, and it happens so quietly that by the time someone realizes what they've become, they're already lost. So here's the unsettling question under pressure. Under influence, could you become something you never thought possible? The answer isn't simple, and in the next part, we'll dive into the psychology of justification. The mental tricks we play on ourselves to silence our conscience and believe we're still the good guy. One of the most dangerous steps in this transformation is self-justification. The unsettling truth is that people almost never see themselves as villains. Even when committing terrible acts, they craft stories that allow them to believe they are still good, still righteous, still fighting for what's right. This is where the concept of cognitive dissonance comes in, introduced by psychologist Leon Festinger. It describes the mental discomfort we feel when our actions don't align with our beliefs. Faced with that tension, people don't usually change their actions. Instead, they change their beliefs to justify what they've done. Picture someone who sees themselves as kind and ethical, yet finds themselves in a situation where they harm others physically, emotionally, or socially. Instead of admitting they've crossed a line, they convince themselves, "I had no choice," or "they deserved it," or "this is for the greater good." These justifications preserve their self-image as a good person, even while doing things they once thought were unthinkable. This explains why history is full of individuals who carried out atrocities while genuinely believing they were doing the right thing. By rewriting the story in their minds, they silence their inner conscience. And once that voice is quiet, the descent into darkness accelerates. But cognitive dissonance isn't the only trap. There's another force that might be even more dangerous: the illusion of righteousness. When people start to believe they are morally superior, it becomes far easier to condemn or harm those they see as less moral. Psychologists call this moral licensing. Think of it like this: someone donates to charity in the morning and then feels less guilty about lying in the afternoon. A leader who believes they're fighting for justice might feel justified in silencing or even punishing anyone who disagrees. The irony is chilling. The more certain someone is of their righteousness, the more blind they become to their own moral failures. And then comes perhaps the darkest step: dehumanization. Once people begin to see others not as fellow humans, but as obstacles, enemies, or threats, their moral restraints collapse. Soldiers in war are trained to see the enemy not as people but as targets. Propaganda has long painted rivals as corrupt evil or even subhuman, precisely because once that mental shift happens, the guilt of harming them disappears. But here's the part most people overlook: this doesn't just happen in wars or politics. It happens in workplaces when cruelty toward a disliked colleague is justified. It happens in relationships when one partner convinces themselves the other deserves their hurtful behavior. It happens online when people hurl insults at strangers they don't see as real. No one is immune, which raises the hardest question yet: if self-justification and the illusion of righteousness are so powerful, what can stop us from sliding further? In the next part, we'll explore the hidden safeguards, the inner defenses that can keep us from losing ourselves even when darkness is pressing in. If good people can slip so easily into darkness, the question becomes, how do we stop it? What safeguards can keep us from crossing those lines? The answer isn't simple, but there are powerful defenses, psychological and moral, that can protect us if we're willing to use them. The first and perhaps most crucial is self-awareness. Many people believe they're immune to corruption simply because they see themselves as good. But as we've seen, morality is fragile. In fact, that belief, "I could never do something like that," is often the first step toward blindness. Real self-awareness means admitting that under the right pressures and the right circumstances, any one of us could be led astray. So how do we build that awareness? Through reflection. Asking ourselves tough questions like, am I justifying something I once believed was wrong? Am I treating someone differently because I see them as less in some way? Am I letting authority or group loyalty decide what I think is right? Questions like these force us to confront uncomfortable truths about our own behavior before it snowballs into something worse. But awareness alone isn't enough. We also need moral courage. It's easy to stand by our values when the cost is low. The real test comes when speaking up means rejection, when doing the right thing risks status, comfort, or safety. History is filled with examples of people who failed that test, those who stayed silent in the face of injustice because it was easier. But it's also filled with heroes who passed, people who refused to conform, who held on to integrity even when it cost them dearly. What makes the difference? Psychologists have found that those who resist corruption often share one trait: a strong internal moral compass. This isn't something that appears overnight. It's built through practice, through small acts of integrity repeated daily. Every time you hold the line on something minor, you strengthen yourself for the bigger battles ahead. Another safeguard is empathy. Many of the forces that turn good people into monsters rely on stripping away empathy, teaching us to see others as different, distant, or undeserving. But empathy cuts through those illusions. Even brief moments of connection, hearing someone's story, learning about their struggles can dissolve prejudice and hostility. The simple act of seeing someone's humanity can stop the cycle before it begins. Finally, we need to remember that corruption is almost never a single event. It's a slow process, small choices, minor compromises, gradual shifts in thinking. And if the descent is gradual, then prevention must be ongoing. It requires vigilance, reflection, courage, and compassion repeated again and again. But there's still one more truth, one more force that underlies everything we've discussed. In the next part, we'll uncover the deepest reason why good people become monsters, the factor that shapes us even more than our intentions. And once you see it, you'll never look at human nature the same way again. There is one final terrifying truth that ties all of this together. Beneath the erosion of morality, the justifications, the obedience, the illusions of righteousness, and even the loss of empathy, there is a deeper force at play: the power of the environment. More than any personal weakness, more than any flaw in character, it is the world around us. The systems we live in, the culture we absorb, the influences we're exposed to that shapes who we become. No one is born a saint or a monster. We are molded day by the conditions in which we exist. Psychologist Philip Zimbardo called this the Lucifer effect, the idea that under certain circumstances, ordinary people can be led to commit extraordinary evil. Not because they are inherently bad, but because their environment slowly distorts their sense of right and wrong. Think about it: a workplace where dishonesty is tolerated eventually normalizes lying. A society that accepts discrimination gradually convinces its people that prejudice is justified. A culture that rewards aggression over compassion produces individuals who see kindness as weakness. And here's the unsettling truth: no one can afford to be complacent. It isn't enough to simply say I'm a good person, because even the best intentions can be twisted by the wrong surroundings. If we don't shape the environments we live in, they will shape us, and not always for the better. But the good news is this power cuts both ways. Just as a toxic environment can corrupt, a healthy one can strengthen. Surrounding ourselves with people who encourage integrity, who challenge us to grow, who hold us accountable, these influences can protect us. The right environment makes it easier to choose empathy, courage, and reflection over compromise and conformity. Still, this leads us to the most haunting question of all. If the environment is so powerful, if it shapes us more than we realize, then how much control do we really have over who we become? The answer is both frightening and liberating. While we cannot always control the world around us, we can control our response to it. We can resist the small compromises. We can question harmful norms. We can choose awareness over blindness, courage over silence, empathy over indifference. Because the battle between good and evil doesn't just happen out there in politics or in history books. It happens inside us every single day in the choices we make. As the philosopher Alexander Solzhenitsyn once wrote, "The line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being, and that line runs through each of us." If the environment can shape us so powerfully, the challenge is clear. How do we keep ourselves from being molded by forces that push us toward corruption? The answer lies in reclaiming responsibility for our choices, moment by moment, day by day. The truth is, there are no absolute monsters and no absolute saints. There are only people, ordinary people, who are influenced by their surroundings, by their peers, by the systems that reward or punish their actions. That's why awareness of this dynamic is so crucial. The moment we forget how vulnerable we are, we open the door for darkness to creep in unnoticed. But here's where the hope lies. Just as environments can corrupt, individuals can resist, and in resisting, they can reshape the environment itself. Think about whistleblowers who refuse to stay silent in corrupt organizations. Think about activists who stand against injustice in societies that normalize cruelty. These people prove that even in hostile conditions, the human spirit can push back. The key is to recognize that the struggle between good and evil is not a single battle, but a series of choices. Every compromise matters. Every rationalization adds up, and every act of courage, no matter how small, strengthens us for the bigger tests ahead. So ask yourself, when you face pressure to go along with something you know is wrong, will you take the easy road or the hard one? When authority tells you to act against your conscience, will you obey or resist? When a group demands blind loyalty, will you question or conform? These moments may not feel monumental, but they are. Because character isn't built in the spotlight, it's forged in the quiet decisions no one else sees. And perhaps the most important realization is this: while we can't choose the world we're born into, we can choose how we navigate it. We can choose the voices we listen to, the people we surround ourselves with, and the values we refuse to abandon. The line between good and evil is not carved in stone. It shifts with our choices, with the influences we accept, and with the courage we summon when it matters most. In the next part, we'll look at the personal responsibility this truth demands, and why the choice between light and darkness is always closer than we think. At this point, the question is no longer whether good people can turn into monsters. We know they can. The real question is, what are we going to do about it? Because if the line between good and evil runs through every human heart, then every one of us carries the responsibility to guard against the darkness inside. The first step is humility. It's easy to point at history and say, I would never have done that. But humility forces us to admit under the same pressures, in the same environment we might have. That admission isn't weakness, it's strength. Because only when we accept our vulnerability can we take the steps needed to protect ourselves. The second step is vigilance. Corruption rarely arrives with a loud announcement. It seeps in quietly through small compromises, subtle justifications, and minor betrayals of conscience. That's why we need to watch ourselves closely to notice when we start bending the truth, excusing cruelty, or silencing empathy. Vigilance means catching the slide before it accelerates. And then there's courage. True moral courage is not about grand gestures, it's about small, costly acts of integrity. Saying no when it would be easier to say yes. Speaking truth when silence would protect you. Standing alone when everyone else chooses conformity. These are the choices that build a strong moral core. But courage doesn't grow in isolation. We need communities that strengthen us, people who challenge us, mentors who guide us, and friends who hold us accountable. Just as toxic environments can corrupt, supportive ones can shield us. The people we allow into our circle matter more than we realize. Finally, we need empathy. When we see others as fully human, when we truly listen to their fears, their struggles, their stories, it becomes far harder to justify harming them. Empathy is not weakness. It's one of the strongest defenses we have against cruelty. In the end, resisting the slide into darkness isn't about being perfect. It's about choosing again and again to align our actions with our deepest values. It's about refusing to let fear, pressure, or anger dictate who we become. And this brings us to the final, most personal truth. Because while we've explored the forces that corrupt, the safeguards that protect, and the power of environment, there is still one last revelation, one that forces each of us to look inward. Here is the ultimate truth: the battle between good and evil is not waged in distant wars in politics or in the headlines. It happens within us, quietly, relentlessly, through the choices we make every single day. The forces we've explored, the slippery slope of compromise, obedience to authority, the illusion of righteousness, the trap of self-justification, and the power of environment are always at work around us, and none of us are exempt. The potential for both compassion and cruelty lives in every human heart. Which side wins depends on the choices we make and the environments we allow to shape us. This means there are no absolute monsters, just as there are no absolute saints. There are only people flawed, vulnerable, capable of both light and darkness. What matters is not what we think of ourselves, but what we choose to do when it counts. The philosopher Alexander Solzhenitsyn said it best. The line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being. That line is not fixed. It shifts moment to moment depending on how we respond to pressure, temptation, and fear. So the question is not whether the darkness exists in you, it does. The question is, are you feeding it or are you resisting it? Every small choice matters. Every time you speak with kindness instead of cruelty, you strengthen the light. Every time you resist an unjust order, you push back against corruption. Every time you refuse to dehumanize someone, even an enemy, you draw the line against becoming what you once despised. And perhaps that is the most liberating truth of all: becoming a monster is not inevitable. The path you walk is built choice by choice, step by step. The environment is powerful, yes, but so is awareness. So is courage. So is empathy. So ask yourself now, who are you becoming? Are you letting small compromises guide you toward a version of yourself you wouldn't recognize? Or are you shaping your character deliberately with integrity and compassion? Because in the end, the difference between a good person and a monster isn't fate. It isn't destiny, it's choice. And that choice is yours to make every single day.